And finally, a few notes about exam preparation. Quizzes and exams are pretty high stakes for students, so it's worth putting in a fair amount of time and effort to make sure that we get them right. My hypothesis, borne out through experience, is that basically you can either put a lot of time into prepping the exam, or you can put a lot of time into grading the exam. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to spend the time somewhere. And my experience has been that the exam is less painful for students, more equitable, and just a more pleasant experience if you weight your time more towards exam preparation rather than having to sort of clean up after the fact while you're grading because some of the questions were ambiguous or students came up with answers you hadn't thought of or other problems of that kind. What kinds of questions in general should go into an exam? Probably some of them should be very similar to what students have seen on homeworks and quizzes. This will allow them to sort of demonstrate that they have achieved mastery of some of the basic material in the formative assessments. We like to include some stretch questions, which are extensions that go beyond what they've already seen. And there's some controversy about whether stretch questions like this are, in some sense, unfair because you know that a lot of students won't get them, or if it's a reasonable way to identify top students so that you can recognize them at grading time. There's also a question that, depending on the type of course, sometimes these stretch questions really call for having a particular flash of insight. And if you don't have the right flash of insight to see how to solve the problem, then no matter how long you spend on the problem, you're sunk. I know that when I was an undergrad, for me, questions in the algorithms courses often had this flavor. You sort of saw the trick to doing the question correctly or you didn't. And if you didn't see the trick, then there was no hope. And if you did see the trick, it was a matter of sort of grinding through and probably getting most of the credit. We like to break down questions into subparts, both for grading and also to avoid cascading failure. If the question is broken into subparts, it makes explicit what the dependencies are between earlier and later parts, and hopefully gives you the instructors the opportunity to try to break the couplings between that, so that messing up an earlier part doesn't necessarily mean that students will get penalized for the later parts. We also like questions that build on homework assignments, and there's practical reasons for this as well, especially if the homework assignment was relatively recent, and especially if we can write questions that rely on students having done the homework but not rely on having them memorize things. A really nice property of these questions is that they also tend to penalize students who have been plagiarizing homeworks, and we know that these things happen. So one way to make sure that the students really are trying to do the homeworks and understand what's going on is to tell them there's going to be questions on a quiz or an exam that build on the work you did in the homework assignment. Typically, homework assignments have reference solutions, so students have every opportunity to study them. And because they're already familiar with the assignment, you don't have to worry about the extra time it will take for them to become familiar with what the question is asking when it shows up on an exam. If you're a GSI and you're working on the exam, give your professors a deadline. If the professors are creating sort of rough content that you're then going to whip into shape, I like to have the first draft of questions at least a week before the exam, because as you'll see, correcting and dry running and editing the exam can take quite a long time. It has to be perfectly clear how many points everything is worth, especially if you have, for example, extra credit or multi-part questions. If you're going to conduct a review session or give out past exams, on the one hand, you want the past exams to be similar, but you don't want them to be so similar that the past exam basically is a clone of the exam that you're giving. So to work all these things out takes time, and you really should be aiming to have a draft of the exam at least a week before to make sure that you can clear all of these preparation logistics. Dry running is super, super, super important. I cannot overemphasize the importance of dry running an exam. For us, dry running an exam means that one person at a time takes the exam under the exact same conditions that a student would. So if it's pencil and paper, they're writing things down. If it's using a quiz administering platform that's online, they're taking the quiz in that platform just the same way as the student would. Ideally, you want the first person to do it, at least, to not have seen the exam content previously, because that will obviously influence how long they take to do it. I ask my GSIs to use a stopwatch and time every single question. That means that they're taking the exam, they're writing out every word of every answer, if it's a pencil and paper exam, or typing it in if it's an online exam. This can expose latent ambiguities in the exam, because thinking you know the answer to a question is very different than actually writing it down knowing that it's going to be graded. And sometimes you really need that level of specificity to find questions that are ambiguous. It also helps with timing. It's very easy to underestimate if you're asking students to write down an answer. It takes time to physically write or type things in, and that has to be considered in computing the time limit that you're going to give for your exam if it's a timed exam. As soon as the dry run is finished, immediately write down any notes. In fact, I would go further and say during the dry run, if a question is particularly worthy of writing notes about, stop the stopwatch, write what you have to write, then restart the timer and continue with your dry run. So what you're looking for are questions where anything at all about the phrasing is ambiguous, where the answer that you as an experienced GSI gave is not the reference answer that was given. Are you sure you're comfortable with why that's the case? Questions where a cheat sheet or additional hints might be needed. For example, a question where you don't want the student burning time trying to remember some little factoid, when in fact, what the question is really supposed to be testing is a skill. In those cases, you can decide whether a student should be allowed to bring a cheat sheet or if you just provide one with the exam itself. Grammatical issues, especially for people whose first language is not English, grammatical issues can throw them off and increase the cognitive load of understanding the question. My view is that exams must be grammatically perfect. If you have any doubts as to whether your quiz is grammatically perfect, find someone who is confident of their abilities. And I'm not just talking about typos and spelling errors. Actual grammar issues can be very confusing for non-native speakers and even for native speakers. So I realize this may be controversial for some, but I think that with a high stakes exam, it's like a textbook. There is no excuse for grammatical errors that could be polished away by someone who is strong in those skills. And basically, you just repeat the dry run procedure until the exam is as perfect as you can make it. It's ambiguity free, the grammar is good, the time for each question has been averaged across 2 or 3 GSIs so that you have a sense of how long the question will take a student. Our rule of thumb is a student will take at least 3x what a GSI would take to answer a typical question. So we use that as a rule of thumb. Have a practice quiz that has fake questions. Part of the dry run is for the students to make sure that they're able to take the quiz. If they're taking the quiz online, we've seen any number of issues that you don't want to have come up when the quiz has started. Students may be using the internet from another country, and they may have VPN issues that don't allow them to get to the quiz content. They may be using an incompatible browser or browser plugin or something about their browser settings that makes the quiz not work correctly. So ideally, create a quiz in which all of the conditions are identical to the real thing, except for the questions. The questions can be something fake, but you need to make sure that the student is able to follow the complete procedure from login to submitting their quiz answers without any hiccups. And believe me, you don't want to find that out during the actual quiz. Even if you're using a common platform like B Courses, which is supported throughout all departments at Berkeley, or if you're using Gradescope to administer multiple choice quizzes, do not assume that students have actually used that platform this semester to successfully take a quiz, especially with the complications of remote learning going on right now. Part of a dry run is to help determine how long the exam is. How long will it take the students to do? And this may depend on whether your exam time is limited to in lecture, whether you can give the exam in the evening, give students more time. A particular heuristic that I have found to work well is 1 point per minute. So a typical 90-minute exam will have 90 points worth of questions. Again, using the guideline that the TAs would take a third to a half as long as a student would take to answer a particular question. This also helps for students who have disability accommodations and need double exam time. You can estimate what that is. And finally, make sure that during your dry run, you're looking at really detailed things. Besides the grammar and the ambiguity of the question content, use consistent typography. If there's code versus explanations, make sure that it's clear what is code and what is an explanation. What parts of the code should be taken literally and what parts are placeholders. If it's a paper exam, number the pages and make sure that each page states how many total pages there are so that a student can easily detect if they received an incomplete exam set. And then you can follow your own guidance depending on whether you want the students to write on separate answer sheets or whether you provide space on the answer sheets. But again, if you provide space on the answer sheets, make absolutely clear what space the students are going to write in, so that you don't have complaints after the fact that, the student wrote part of the answer on the back, but they didn't get credit for it. And finally, when it comes time to grade the exam, obviously a consistent rubric is critical. We use Gradescope, and if you're doing any manual grading, you should use it too. For select all that apply questions, you have to decide how you're going to grade them if the students don't get them exactly right. For example, if they're given 5 choices and 3 of the choices apply, how should they be graded if they don't correctly decide which of the boxes should be checked or unchecked? The typical scheme that we use is we give students 1/n points for each correctly dispositioned box. So a box that should be checked and is, or a box that shouldn't be checked and isn't, gives them 1/n of the points, where n is the number of total boxes. But we also penalize when they misdisposition a box. So if they check a box that should not be checked, or if they leave empty a box that should be checked, that counts as a minus. And it's subject to the floor that they can never get less than 0 points for the question as a whole. As I mentioned, cascading failures, making sure the questions are not written in such a way that getting an early part of the question wrong will doom them to get the later parts of the question wrong as well. Deciding how you're going to handle regrade requests. What evidence does the student have to present before a regrade request can be taken seriously? Is it clearly, if an error was made, if you published a rubric and you have a rubric in, for example, Gradescope, and the student was not graded in a consistent way with respect to that rubric, they should certainly get regraded. But once the rubric has been established, our view is that questions about the rubric are really not in scope anymore. The rubric may be unfair in the eyes of some students. In fact, you may decide ultimately to simply eliminate some questions from consideration for that reason. But once the rubric is established, every student should be graded in a consistent way according to that same rubric. Similarly, if you decide to give makeup exams, is it that students can get all of the points back that they missed? Can they get part of the points back? What's the time limit on doing it? Those are things that will have to be left up to you. Cheating remains a problem. We ask the students to usually sign an attestation to the honor code on the exam, as well as for the course as a whole. If the exam is taking place in a physical room, we ask the students to get the name and signatures of the students sitting on either side of them. So if the suspicion of cheating arises later, we can sort of reconstruct where students were cheating. Proctoring is quite fraught, and right now, especially with distance learning, I don't want to get on either side of that argument. But the bottom line is that cheating is usually detected after the exam and not during the exam. So even if you are doing some sort of proctoring, such as video proctoring, most of the time it's going to be suspicious answers that look the same when they shouldn't, that will lead you to then look for whether there was suspicious behavior during the exam. So that's it. I hope you found these tips on creating quizzes and exams useful. It's hard work to create them. It's hard work to grade them, but I can tell you that both the students and the GSIs really appreciate it if you take the time in advance to create questions that are unambiguous, that are going to be straightforward to grade, and most importantly, that have been dry run under the same conditions a student would take them by one or more of your GSIs. Thanks, and hey, good luck on the test.